Yes, the Acton Racecourse. Well, that was a very important part of Canberra's sort of sporting environment in 1950, and of course there were mainly picnic races held at the Acton Racecourse, and they were big days. The picnic races. Yass was another big picnic area, but picnic race area. But and when I was working at the old hospital building, we'd know about when the picnic race day was on, and at lunchtime, particularly and roundabout, we'd sit on the edge of looking down at the racecourse and watching the races. And one of the interesting highlights or sidelights of the races was because when they started, they went right round the other western side and sort of got lost. There was an area which was quite not seen by where they started from, and as they came round the corner where we were looking straight down on, the jockeys were absolutely livid with each other. They were shouting and telling each other to get out of the effing way. I want to get through. and they jostled there, and the language was a highlight or a low light of the almost as bad as the Australian cricket team. But yes, so we had a great laugh when they came round, and they were probably, when they got round back to the starting or the finishing point, they were probably very gentlemanly sort of picnic race day riders.
At the racecourse, from the starting line, the course ran along, you say, parallel to Sullivan's Creek, where it dipped down, and from the finish line at ground level, looking across the racecourse, all you could see would be just the hats or the caps of the jockeys. You couldn't see a horse at all. You just the shoulders and hats of the jockeys. So anything that went on in that area was not available to the steward's discipline or whatever you might say. And then they'd round the corner in the straight down towards the old hospital site up on the hill, where the racecourse turned around, or rounded there and down the straight to the finish line. So whatever went on there went on and was known to the jockeys and the Lord above only.
The racecourse was immediately in front of Springbank Island, between Springbank Island and what is now Old Canberra House. And we leased the inner aspect of that for growing crops. And we had a very nice crop of oats in there one year, and my parents got a complaint from the racegoers because they couldn't see the horses going around on the far side of the racecourse because our oats was too high and obscuring the view. So that was interesting, but of course wasn't that long till they harvested it. I could sit in the front veranda and just look at the races, but we never were really interested. I just remember as a child sometimes we would go, there was a starting gate. I don't know which furlong it was, but it was sort of over here. And my cousin and I used to go and just stand at the fence, not to watch the start, but we used to like to listen to the jockeys swearing, because, you know, you weren't allowed to do that, being little kids, and the language was fruity. So, you know, we were really interested in the races, I don't think, but yes. And that was in the days when there were no stalls for horses in the racetrack. They were behind I guess it was an elastic type of rope, and when the starter pressed a button, must have gone up, I think. Must have gone up, because if it had gone down, the horses would have got caught in it, so it must have gone up. And then some years later they bought a portable starting gates for the races.
It was a social occasion, you know, like the races now. All you ladies get dressed up and so forth and so on, and men. And it was the same at that time in Canberra.
That was a big event. I mean, you wore your hat and your gloves to the races at Acton when you went, yeah.
Oh, everyone dressed up. You know, all the ladies with their lovely big hats and all their beautiful clothes, and the men dressed up in suits, and they all always wore a hat. And you just always notice when a man, he would tip his hat to a lady, you know, they just, with their greeting. So it was, I like those old manners of the people. I loved picking the who was going to win the race by the look of the horse. You know, big chestnut. Oh, he looked very smart, and I was actually quite good at it. Just saying, and then the number you'd pick, lucky number, and I used to love watching all the what were they? The strappers. I don't think they called them strappers then, but strappers would walk the horses around, you know, showing them before the race. And yes, I loved looking at it. I loved watching that part of it because I loved horse riding itself.
I just recall seeing a story or hearing a story about one of the doctors here who used to like horse racing, and so he'd go to the races every Saturday down here, and the nurses they had a code for if he was needed urgently, they'd put a white sheet out the window and they'd wave the sheet, and he'd know to look up every now and again, and if he saw the sheet he had to rush off back up to the hospital for whatever emergency was there. And I can just imagine that happening.
I remember when I was probably 13, 14, I went along with an uncle and aunt. He was a punter and they had 2 children who were aged 6 and 8. And somehow I remember swings. And I've recently found a map, and there on the map is a little circle of swings. And I used to amuse the children, push them on the swings while their mum and dad went up to the betting ring, I guess.
I suppose there would have been betting. There was plenty of SP bookies around Canberra at the time, and they'd be there. One guy, Frank McDonald, was a very well-known SP bookie here in 1950. He turned up at all those, every club in Canberra at the time.
Yeah, well, the racecourse was a genuine racecourse, and they had a bookmakers' circle. SP bookies were illegal, and you can read histories of Canberra and you can't find bookies who had such an influence over us as kids. We'd place the odd little bet, but they were to be seen everywhere. When you're a teenager and eligible to drink, the bookies were a major presence in pubs. And guys like Bull MacDonald were great personalities, heart as big as Farlap, and charitable fellows, and they were part of the fabric of society. They're great friends with wide circles. And the bookmakers that operated illegally at the Hotel Kingston and the Civic and Wellington and so on were up there with doctors and professors and others, and being influential and highly regarded, respected citizens. So the racing fraternity was big there in Acton, and was big has and still is big in the Canberra community. I know the dairy farmers at Fishwick generally occupied executive or director positions on not only the racecourse but the annual Canberra show.
In 1952, I married Dougal Stuart, who was a dairy farmer along the Molonglo River at Fishwick. And that probably is where my connection with Springbank at Acton begins. I used to go there all the time to watch the races at Acton, take the kids, and we'd watch it from Springbank Island. You could see the racecourse from there. And my husband and his father raced horses. Mr. Stuart was the first secretary of the racing club, which goes back to the early 1920s. He was also the first secretary for the golf course, which was on Acton, and the Highland gatherings, which were all done on that course. He was the secretary of the Burns Club, which organised these Highland gatherings. Dougal, actually, when he was 9 years old, his father put a stopwatch in his hand and said, "Go and time the races." And that's where he started. He started at Acton at about 9 years of age, and then he became a committeeman in his early 20s, and he was associated with racing until he died in 2010. I can remember all the Scottish people. Mr. Bob Norgrave was the man on the horse, the clerk of the course. He got a photo of Bob, and he went on to be clerk of the course at the new racetrack too. He actually died, fell off his horse right in front of everybody. Yeah, had a heart attack right in front of us and fell. That was Bob Norgrove, and there was the Cargills, the McIntoshes, the McGregors. And Edlingtons were a strong family of racing people. Bill Edlington and Harry and Tom Edlington, they were all on the committee down there at Acton Racecourse.
Harry had started racing horses in 1952. He raced horses up until he died in 99, yes. The old one at Acton was very
primitive.
Very primitive.
They were just very basic stalls, and they had 2-3 rooms.
Oh, a few old bleacher seats, that's all you had, no grandstand. At the old one at Acton.
No, there were no lawns, it was
just dirt, grass. Yeah.
During the 30s, Mum and my dad, their love of horses proceeded to race horses, and they owned a number of horses over the years that raced at Acton. One of them, I believe, was called Gay Eaton, and I've been trying to track down the names of some of the other horses. I have one, but I can't for the life of me remember it. None of them won too much because I've ended up poor. If they'd won, I'd have ended up wealthy.
Dad breds quite a few race horses, and they always raced down at Acton. And there were a lot of jockeys who didn't like. One pulled a horse on Dad, and Dad said, "You'll never ride a horse for me here ever again." And he didn't ride for Dad. And Dad was always generous. Beside their prize money they got, Dad would always give them other money.
Actually, I did ride my own little horse on a race, on a Gymkhana race. Old Toby. He was a quick little horse off the mark. He'd go fast for the first 300 or 400 yards, and I rode him in a race along there, and all in the grandfather's colours and goodness knows what all. Old Toby. I don't think we won that race. We might have come second to it, but he was a great little horse. It was my big day as a jockey. Well, Toby, he's named after my horse, Toby, the real horse, and I found him abandoned in Acton cottages after they'd all been abandoned and vacated. They weren't vandalised, they were just open, and I was wandering through on some occasion. I'd like to think it was work-related, and wandering through one of the vacated cottages, I found Toby, a lonely-looking horse, sitting in the corner of an empty room, just looking for someone to say, "G'day," sort of thing. So I took him home. He was not as splendid looking now as he was then, or he's not as splendid then as he is now. And my father restored him, painted him up, gave him a bridle, gave him a saddle. I think his tail might be original. Not much of it. Yeah, it's the original tail, a bit sparse, but his tail's original. He had no colour on him at all. He had to restore his broken leg and put a bridle on him. And there he is today. And he was a great toy of my kids. The kids all grew up with Toby. And we might even pass him on down to our great-grandchildren. That's if they're so inclined to ride rocking horses, which were thing of the day back then. Now, of course, they're a collector's item. Me and Toby. A great companion.